In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use aperture mode on your camera to control background blur. So, do you want your background to be in focus or do you want your background to be blurry? I will show you how to control that. Now, the first question though is why? Why would you want your background blurry or why would you want everything to be in focus? Well, when you make your background blurry, there are a couple of things that it helps. First of all, if you have a very distracting background, you can help to minimize those distractions by making them blurry. The second thing is that when your main subject is in focus, then they're nice and crisp and our eye is naturally drawn to them. Anything that is nice and crisp in the photo and in focus, your eye will be drawn there. So if everything is in focus, your eye isn't necessarily drawn to anything in particular. It kind of goes all over the place. But in this portrait, as you can see, my son is in focus, and so your eye naturally goes there. Now, the background to this photo is still important, and it adds some context. You can see that there are other people holding candles, and so even when the background is blurry, it can still play an important role in your photo. Now, with something like a landscape or nature photo, perhaps architecture, and certainly even some portraits, you might want to keep everything in focus because it's all important. And so in this particular photo, I wanted the foreground and the middle ground here and the background to all be in focus. I wanted a nice, crisp, solid photo of this landscape. All right, here is how you put your camera into aperture mode where you can take control of the aperture. So you're going to switch the dial on the top of your camera to A or AV. Canon cameras have a little V after the A, but they're both the same thing. It stands for aperture or aperture value. And then this will allow you to take control of your camera lens's aperture. Now, even though you're controlling it with your camera, the aperture is something that's actually in your lens. If you're not sure how to take control and change your aperture, which I will be talking about in a moment, then you need to Google whatever camera you're using and then a phrase like how to control the aperture. So Nikon D3200, how to control aperture, or Canon Rebel T3i, how to adjust aperture, something like that. Okay, so aperture is measured in f, and so this middle guide in the middle is telling us what the aperture is at on the camera, and you can see the f over here. So we are at f3.5. Now, when you want a blurry background, you need to get your f number as low as it can go. So with the lens that happened to be on this camera at the time, it was f3.5. Sometimes when you zoom in, the aperture begins to close and that number begins to increase up to, say, 5.6. So just know that on many lenses, the most you're going to be able to open your aperture, the lowest number you'll be able to get is 3.5, maybe even 5.6, especially if you have zoomed in with your lens. But there are specialty lenses like the 50 millimeter portrait lens that has an aperture of f1.8, and the f1.8 will really help you to get a really blurry background. You can still get a blurry background with f3.5 and 5.6, but the higher that number goes, especially when you start getting up to f11, the more the background is going to remain in focus. Now, I do have another quick lesson about achieving maximum background blur, and it's not only aperture. There are other ingredients that go into the process, but you want to start with the lowest aperture number you can get. f3.5, maybe it's going to be f5.6. Hopefully you get your hands on a 50 millimeter lens, which are usually very affordable, especially for Nikon and Canon, and you get 1.8. Now, when it comes to keeping your foreground and background in focus, you want a higher number. So right now, this aperture is set to f16. So basically, when you get to f8, f11, f16, 22, 32, and there are some steps in between here. You may see other numbers coming up, but the larger the number, the higher the number, the more everything is going to be in focus. And this is a good point to explain the terminology of opening and closing your aperture. I do have a video explaining what aperture is. You can go back and watch that. When you open your aperture larger and you get those you get those little numbers like 3.5 and 1.8, you're going to get more background blur. Now notice I said open the aperture larger, but the number has to be smaller. There is a lot of confusing terminology in photography. Don't worry so much about understanding the physics of the aperture. Just understand when you get that low number, f1.8 or 3.5, you're going to get more background blur. And the terminology is you have opened your aperture. The closing aperture refers to higher numbers like f8, 11, 16, 22, and this is where you get more of the background in focus. I understand that this can be confusing, and so you just take the part of this that is the simplest. Little number equals background blur. Big number equals background in focus. Okay, so here's a photo where I really wish the background had been blurry because it would have minimized these distractions. I wish I could have been at f1.8. For some reason, I was at f11 and everything stayed in focus. Now, let me show you just a few sample photos here. Okay, so I'm at f1.8, and you can still see my daughter's face. Very blurry, but you can still see it. So this is a case where I wanted the ladybug to be nice and sharp and in focus. I still wanted to see the expression on my daughter's face, but I wanted it to be blurry so that your eye goes to the ladybug. It's more about the ladybug. And it is about her reaction, but her reaction is so large, her face is so large in the photo, that blurring it a bit helps you to see the ladybug. So even a blurry background can still be an important part of the photo. This is at f16, and you see that basically foreground, middle ground, and background are all in focus. In this photo, it's approximately f8. It's a portrait of my son, and the background is important. So I wanted it to be maybe a tiny bit blurry, but not very blurry at all. So f8 for this picture. And those jukeboxes in the background of this diner were an important part of the background, and so that's why I didn't want them to be blurry. If they were totally blurry, you wouldn't really be able to see what they were. Now here's a nature photo, and you may think that nature photos, everything is supposed to be in focus. And that's not the case. You can do whatever you want. You can blur what you want and keep in focus what you want. The important thing here is it's a portrait of my daughter, and I wanted her to be in focus. I wanted the background to be in focus, but you can still, or out of focus, but you can still tell what the background is. So it's still an important part of the photo. We've already looked at this photo. Again, this is f1.8. This is approximately f11, and I wanted, again, foreground, my daughter in the foreground, my son in the background, or my son in the middle ground, and even working into the background. I wanted this whole mucky scene to be in focus because it's just such a gross scene, and it's all important to the photo. Again, foreground, middle ground, background, all basically in focus, which is usually very pleasing for a landscape photo, but it does not have to be that way. And there we are back at the beginning. Okay, so remember the aperture will when you adjust the aperture to a lower number like 1.8 or 3.5, you're going to get a more blurry background. And this is a creative decision that you need to make. Look at the moment and ask yourself, is this moment, will it look better if the background is blurry? Or is the background important and I want it to be part of the photo? Then I'm going to choose f11 or f16 or f22 to keep everything more in focus. Go out and practice this a lot, and try every time you take a picture, if possible, try an aperture of let's just say 3.5, you know, the low number to get a blurry background, and then also try a higher number like f16 or 22 to get more of the photo in focus. And before long, this will become second nature, and you will be able to use it as a creative ingredient in your process of photography.